Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. So our topic today is keeping flowers healthy for beautiful blooms. And we've been spending a lot of time this year in the horticulture program talking about pollinators and planting flowers to support our pollinator community. But we want to make sure that we keep those flowers healthy so that they do produce a good quantity of blooms. We provide that nectar and pollen that they're looking for. And that if we do encounter diseases that are reducing the productivity of our flowers, that we're managing it in a way that is not detrimental to our pollinators. So we're going to focus on disease management today and recognizing some of the common diseases we see and talking about different strategies we can use to keep those in check. So I want to start out with our very first poll question and find out a little bit more about why you grow flowers. And, of course, there's benefits to gardening, but there's also weeding and mosquitoes, and it takes a lot of time in the hot part of summer when we could be at the beach or doing other things. So what is it that inspires you to get out into the garden and plant more flowers? And if you see the red arrow will indicate that you should be answering in your side panel. You should be able just to click on the answer. I do see answers coming in, which is great. We have had issues on tablets and other portable devices. So if you are on a portable device, you may not be able to participate, in which case just answer in your head and we'll talk about the results and you can kind of see where you fall with the rest of everyone here. Okay. And Christy, I think we've got everyone, so if you want to go ahead and close that, we can go ahead and see our results here. Can you show us the results, Christy? All right, here is hoping you guys can see the results. There we go. No answer. So some time to spend outdoors, I see, to add color and beauty to your landscape, to your life. Let me see here.
Do you see it now, Michelle? The attendees should be able to see it now.
The attendees should be able to see it. I can see one answer at a time if I scroll through. But I do see that we have 25 people to add beauty and color, and 20 to enhance your property, 19 to attract birds, butterflies, and other pollinators, some for teaching kids about nature, getting exercise, spending time outdoors. So all of those are great reasons to be out in your flower garden and adding more flowers to our landscape. And the reason that I ask people to think about why they're putting flowers in their landscape is our ultimate goal for the garden will affect our management decisions when we're talking about plant diseases. And particularly for flower gardens, we want to set management goals where we're doing something that looks good and we're using management strategies that are not going to be harmful to our pollinators, to wildlife, to the people that are going to be using the garden, and that we have a strategy where we're reaching our goals, but we're not striving for perfection. And it's important to understand that there are no 100% disease-free plants. I did find these on the internet. Down here are disease-free plants. Apparently you can plant them in either soil or Play-Doh, and they will do very well. But if we're actually going to grow live plants, there's a lot of natural pathogens in the environment that will come in. And we want to find out how to keep them at a tolerable level where they can be there and not harm our plants and not bother us too much. And which ones we have to take a little more seriously and step in and intervene. But what are some of the strategies to kind of keep these pathogens in check so we can meet the ultimate goals of having this beautiful garden, having these beautiful plants in our lives? Okay, so what are some of those strategies? One of the first things to do to help keep our plants healthy is actually start out with a plant that will thrive in our conditions. And we don't often think of this as a disease management strategy, but plants do have natural defenses. And if that plant is happy and it's in the environment that it needs, it's got the nutrients and the water that it needs, then its own natural defenses are going to be at their strongest. And it's also going to be growing and thriving at a rate where it's going to be able to tolerate minor infections that a stressed out plant that's maybe in too much shade or too much sun wouldn't be able to tolerate. So when we start out, we want to make sure we know our site conditions. We know which horticulture zone that we're gardening in, how much sunlight that plant is going to get, how much space it has to grow, and then pair that with a plant that fits. The availability of irrigation. So is this something that's going to be hit with a regular timed irrigation system, or is this something that is up to whatever Mother Nature gives it for the growing season? Because plants have different levels of tolerance for that. And knowing our soil type as well. And then once we know our site conditions, we can pair plants up that will thrive under those conditions. And one of the best places to look for information is actually the plant labels themselves. There's a lot of information there. If you do have tough sites that you're trying to deal with, looking online for particular plants that do well in heavy clay, you can find some information there on the Extension webpage. Things like that that'll really thrive in those conditions and help your plants be strong enough to defend themselves against pathogens that do show up. There you go. This is just a couple of examples I threw in of plants that are not doing so well because they've met that kind of double whammy of poor site conditions combined with a plant pathogen. And the one in the upper corner here, this is a peony. And peonies, of course, really want full sun. They love, multiple hours of sun each day, and that's what they're going to thrive in. This poor peony is actually being shaded by two trees that it was probably in full sun when it was first planted, and eventually the two trees on both sides of it grew together and have shaded it out. And on top of that, it has developed a fungal leaf spot disease called peony measles. That disease can come in on peonies on full sun, but we usually see just a few leaf spots in that case. But when you have a peony that's in shade, this usually not terribly threatening disease becomes a lot more detrimental to the plant, and you can see this peony is really suffering. In the bottom corner here, we have some plants that are suffering from Impatiens root rot. So this was an area that was poorly drained. It actually needed to be dug to break up some of the compacted soil in there, redirect some water from that area. And whenever we have standing water in poorly drained areas, we can have some of these root rot issues. And so in this case, it's adjusting the soil and the site before you put the plants in there. And if it's really too difficult to change, then it would be looking at plants that can really tolerate wet, heavy soils. Okay. As we're choosing plants for the garden, we also want to keep an eye out for resistant varieties that might be available. So a resistant variety is a plant that's been chosen because it has something in its genetics that allows it to recognize the pathogen and turn on its defenses and defend itself. And so in some cases, this means we see no disease whatsoever. In other cases, it means the disease shows up, but it's kept in check, and so we see only a very mild version of it. But it's important to understand that resistance is specific to one pest or pathogen. And so in this case, my picture over here, Flower Power Phlox, is a powdery mildew resistant phlox variety. So you can see it looks really great. The white is the blossom, not the powdery mildew. And so this is one that we could put in and replace the plant that suffered from powdery mildew. We would not expect this plant to be resistant to a virus or root rot, because the resistance is going to be specific to powdery mildew. But it's a great option if that's the problem we're dealing with. So the place that we look for resistant varieties is going to be plant catalogs, plant labels. There are some online publications. In the flower garden, we're often able to find resistant varieties if it's a commonly grown plant that has a really common plant disease. So phlox and powdery mildew is a great example. A lot of people grow phlox, and many of the people that do have problems with powdery mildew. And so as a result, nurseries have worked to get varieties that have resistance. But unfortunately, we don't have resistance to every disease that's out there. And in some cases, our best bet is to switch to a completely different plant. So if we have a plant that's been suffering from powdery mildew or rust or something like that, and there's no resistant variety, one option is also to switch to a plant from a different plant family. and put it in that place. Because if we want something that is yellow and about 1 to 2 foot tall, there's a lot of different options there. And if the plant we have is really suffering from a disease, we can switch that out with something else that fits the same niche in the landscape, but doesn't suffer from the disease problem. Okay, so our plant diseases are caused by a number of different microorganisms. And the ones we see most commonly are the fungi. So here's our powdery mildew on phlox. We also see bacteria in the flower garden and viruses from time to time. A little less common are nematodes. These are small round worms. This is a picture of a foliar nematode, one that comes up and feeds in the leaves, but we also see nematodes that feed in the roots. And a phytoplasma is a small bacteria that lives in the vascular system. And the one that we see in flower gardens is aster yellows, and it shows up some years and not in other years. There we go. So where do our plant pathogens come from? And Christy's going to open that poll for us, and you can see there's a couple options. So just look on the right-hand side there, and go ahead and mark your answer. Where do you think these pathogens are coming from? Okay, I've got a number of options in here. Last few seconds here, our poll will close. And so I see that we've got several votes in all of these different categories and 28 in all of the above. And all of the above have it. You're not incorrect if you answer anything else other than none of the above, because we do see our plant pathogens moving in on the wind, on infected plant debris. They can come in on insects, transplants. Sometimes they survive in weeds, or they get moved around on contaminated tools. And so the important thing to think about here is which of these can we actually control? If fungal spores are blowing into the garden on wind, there's not a lot we can do about that. If there are leafhoppers coming in with aster yellows, there's also not much we can do about that. One thing we can do is we can think about the plants that we're bringing into the garden and the seeds that we're bringing into the garden, and making sure that any plant that we purchase and plant into our garden space is healthy to begin with. And so that means when you're going to the garden center, you want to be inspecting all plants prior to purchase. And many of our leaf spot diseases start on the lower inner part of the canopy. So this is a salvia in the corners here, and you can see there's some browning on the lower foliage and some leaf spots. So that's actually a fungal leaf spot disease that's already started on this potted plant. And so you can purchase this, and when you put it in your garden, it's already infected and will continue to spread. So you want to look for any discoloration on stems, on leaves. You actually want to pop it out of the pot, and take a look at the roots. Ideally, we want lots of white fibrous root hairs and thick white to off-white fleshy roots. If we see mushy roots, soft, discolored roots, a lack of those fibrous root hairs, then that's a plant that's suffering from root rot, and we want to reject that plant. Another sign of root rot is often when we have these trays or flats, and you can see that some of them look empty or the plants are really struggling. So that's a sign that something's going on that's not allowing those plants to thrive, and it's often a root rot pathogen or damping off pathogen. So it's important to understand that we don't want to try and save a sick plant. A sick plant belongs in the nursery compost pile and not in your garden. You want to buy the healthiest, most vigorous looking plant you can find that is going to be at that point when you put it in your garden, it just takes off and thrives. Unfortunately, when we purchase plants that have a pathogen, oftentimes that plant may or may not survive, but it's going to be the pathogen that's most likely to stick around in your garden. And it may spread from that plant to other plants in your garden and cause problems for years to come. So don't save that sick plant. Leave it behind. Pick the healthy, vigorous, great-looking plant. And if you are at a garden center and you see a group of plants where many of the plants look like they have disease symptoms, don't buy any of those plants. In the nursery, the plants will share a lot of practices. So they'll all be watered together, fertilized together, pruned together, and it's very easy for one sick plant to infect the entire group. And just because one plant in that group looks healthy now, doesn't mean it doesn't have the early stages of infection. So it's best to get a group of plants that all look good and pick the best one of those to take home with you to your garden. Okay? Another place that pathogens can move into the garden or move from one place of our garden to another is on our tools. So this may be your shovels and your trowels. It can also be things like peony cages or trellises. And so before we bring any of this into the garden, we want to make sure we scrape off any soil, leave behind any plant debris, and then you can clean your tools just once a year is fine with a 10% bleach solution. And so that's 1 part household bleach and 9 parts water. That will surface sterilize all of the metal tools and things like that. You might also consider cleaning them off if you know that you've had a particular plant disease and you're in there working on cleaning up an infected plant. You might want to clean your tools after that. But definitely before putting things out in the garden for the beginning of the growing season, we want to clean things up. If you do have tools with a really nice sharp edge on them, bleach can be kind of corrosive for that. And so Lysol would be another alternative that you could use to clean those sharp cutting edges. Okay. One strategy in preventing disease that a lot of people don't think about is using a diversity of flowers. So a lot of our plant pathogens can only infect either one species or one family of plants. And they have a hard time infecting other plants, and they just won't cause an infection or disease in them at all. And so by planting a diversity of flowers, we do a couple of things. First of all, it reduces the impact of any single plant disease that's out there. If it can only take out a small portion of the plants in the garden, you still have a lot of other plants to sort of fill in that space, fill in the color, and take over for the one diseased plant. It can also do a lot to slow the spread of the plant disease. So if we have a disease that comes in on our petunias and the plants all around it are of a different family, then the pathogen and our fungi and bacteria are often spread on splashing rain or on blowing wind. They're going to have to move farther to find the next susceptible plant. So it really slows the spread and the development of that particular disease. So here's a question for you. Which of these two gardens has a higher tolerance for disease? Garden A, the University of Minnesota, or Garden B that's actually from the Landscape Arboretum. Both of them look beautiful. They're great, beautiful colors, but a very different planting style. We have a lot more diversity in Garden B than in Garden A. So go ahead and we'll take a minute to answer that question. Okay. So enter in your last answers here, and then Christy, you can probably go ahead and close that poll so we can go ahead and move on here.
And it's the reason why you don't see the results right away is sometimes, it didn't do it this time. Last time it would take 10 seconds each time it closed to finish getting the answer. So that's why there was a delay. Sorry about that.
Nope, no problem. Okay, and so I see a lot of votes for Garden B, and Garden B is the correct answer. So if you think about if we had a leaf spot on our Pica nicotiana here, the leaves, it would be largely hidden by this lovely little ornamental calyx we have in front. If we had a disease that took out our begonias in front here, we could potentially even remove all of those and come in and put in some mulch or put in some late fall flowering flowers or something along those lines. Whereas if we have this Garden A and something happens. Those are all impatiens, by the way. Something like Impatiens downy mildew comes in. You can see the impact of what that's going to do to that flower bed. So these are all gardens in 2010 where they were dependent on just impatiens. These are the standard impatiens, and Impatiens downy mildew came in and very rapidly spread through the entire planting. And you can see there's very little that can be done to recuperate these gardens. So you have the choice of leaving these really strange-looking de-leafed impatiens, or ripping them out and having just bare soil in that space. So the monoculture of one flower can be really hard when the right disease comes in. Okay, once our plants are in the ground, we do want to be scouting throughout the growing season for plant disease problems. This means once a week or every other week as you're out in the garden doing other things like weeding or watering, really stopping and looking to inspect plants. And so start in the lower leaves. Again, many of our leaf spot diseases start on that lower inner canopy where humidity is high. And look to see if you have any leaf spots down there starting out. Look for any plants that seem to be growing unusually or not growing at the rate of their neighbors. And then there's several different online resources that can be used to help you identify the particular pest or pathogen that's causing the problem. So what's wrong with my plant is on the Extension webpage. It can help you diagnose a pest or pathogen. Working with either Extension staff, educators, or other Master Gardener volunteers to tap into their knowledge base and find out what's going on with those plants. And you can always submit a sample to the University of Minnesota Plant Diagnostic Clinic, which there's a fee for that service, but they will be able to diagnose that by looking for the microorganism that's causing the problem. And I do encourage you to keep up with the Yard and Garden news as many times as we're getting calls and comments about different pest problems in the Yard and Garden. That's the place where we're going to post an article about that as we're finding out about it. There we go. Okay, so who are our usual suspects? One of the most common types of diseases we see in the flower garden are leaf spots, blotches, and blights. And so these diseases are largely caused by fungal or bacterial pathogens. Most of them are kind of a natural part of the ecosystem. They may be infecting weeds or surviving in plant debris from one season to the next. They are often either blown in on wind or splashed about on water. And most of them need freestanding moisture on the foliage in order to start an infection. So they need that thin layer of either dew or irrigation in order for that spore to germinate and infect the plant tissue. But as far as the health of the plant goes, these are actually considered a minor stress on the plant. And you can kind of judge how much damage the pathogen is doing to the plant by the amount of green that's still present. So you can see in these pictures that even though we do have leaf spots present, the dominant color on those plants is still green. We don't have a significant amount of leaf loss there. The plant's still able to do photosynthesis. And you can see in the zinnia and in the sedum that we still have decent flowering going on, despite the fact that the pathogen is still there. So our goal with these types of diseases is actually to change the environmental conditions so that it is more favorable to the plant and less favorable to the pathogen, because we want to keep it in the lowest level of infection possible, where we just have a few leaf spots on our lower leaves and it's not causing significant damage to the plant. So one of the strategies that we use in order to do that is to think about keeping the plant canopy dry and reducing the amount of time that those leaves are wet and the flowers and the stems as well. So what are some of the strategies you could use in your garden in order to keep your plants dry? Right, and I see we've got answers coming in here, looking pretty good. Christy, I think if you close the poll, like seconds before it turns itself off, it goes quicker. There we go. So I see a lot of answers here, and again, all of the above is going to be the correct answer for this one. So there's a lot of different strategies we can use to reduce moisture in the plant canopy. So we got to think about how our plants are getting wet in the first place. It may be water that we're applying to the garden, in which case if we can switch from using sprinklers to using either drip irrigation or soaker hose, that can be really useful. If sprinklers are really the only option, then think about watering early in the day on a sunny day. And the goal is that once you put water on that plant, you want it to dry off very quickly. Because the shorter the leaves are wet, the better it is for the plant, and the worse it is for the pathogen. So you want to keep that foliage dry. Mulch will help to reduce the humidity in the plant canopy. It also means you have to water less frequently, and we want to water less frequently. The longer dry spells we have in between irrigation events, that means, again, that foliage stays drier for longer. So we want to water deeply and infrequently. So we get a nice deep root system that can tolerate a little bit of drying, and we're using those sprinklers or other irrigation systems less frequently. Another common thing that I see in the perennial garden in particular is once the plants have gotten to the point where they're really well established and the ones that spread are starting to spread, things are getting overgrown, that's when we really see these leaf spot and leaf blight diseases take off because the moisture accumulates as those plants start shading each other and leaning against each other. So we really want to work to thin overgrown perennials and remove weeds that are crowding the plants as well. It's also important to realize that we shouldn't be working in the plants when they're wet, especially if we have leaf spot, leaf blight diseases already occurring. And one of the things about these fungal and bacterial pathogens is when those leaves are wet, that's when they're reproducing. So they're producing a whole new set of fungal spores, new bacteria are being grown, and if you're in there working when the foliage is wet, that's a time that you're going to end up getting a lot of spores on your hand and bacteria on your hands and tools, and it's easy for you to spread it throughout the garden as you're working. So particularly if you have leaf blight diseases present, wait until that foliage dries off before you get in there to do your weeding or staking or whatever it is that you're doing in the garden that day. As you go throughout the growing season, sanitation can help to remove and reduce the pathogen population in the garden. So you should be scouting, and when you're scouting and you start to see those leaf spot diseases forming, you can actually just pinch off those infected leaves, and you want to remove them completely from the garden, because they will survive in plant debris. But you want to pull those infected parts out, and remember that each one of those leaf spots produces new spores that can spread and cause new disease. So as you pinch out those leaves, you're reducing the pathogen's ability to spread. An important piece to remember, however, is you never want to remove more than a third of a plant's foliage, or you're doing more damage than the pathogen. In the end of the year, particularly if you have diseases that have kind of gotten ahead of you and things got pretty severe, you want to go out at the end of the season before frost hits and look for the plants that have either infection on their stems or infection on their leaves, and cut them off at the soil line. You can wait until the frost at that point, and then cut them all off at the soil line and pull them out of the garden. Things like roses, where you have perennial above ground stems, woody plant parts, breaking up those infected leaves. Again, many of these pathogens survive in infected plant debris, so we want to pull that out of there at the end of the season so it can't survive where the plant's going to be growing the next year. So my question then is, what should you do with infected leaves, stems, or plants? Go ahead and answer that on the side here. Go. All right, Christy, why don't you go ahead and close that poll just so we can keep on track here. And so you guys got a little free clue there because my animation didn't work. You weren't supposed to see that compost pile composted until the end. So in Minnesota, there is a law that says that yard waste cannot go into the landfill. And so we cannot put these plant material into the trash. What we do want to do is we actually want to take them to a compost that is going to get hot. And so a compost pile that heats up to 148 degrees Fahrenheit and breaks down that plant material, so it looks like just kind of an organic soil-like material, is going to be effective in eliminating the majority of plant pathogens we see in the yard and garden. So that means if you have a backyard compost and you know it warms up, that's an acceptable place. If your backyard compost, you're not sure if it gets hot enough, then go ahead and take it to a municipal compost facility, because many times they have so much plant material, they need to be able to really heat that up to move through that pile. But we would not be able to put that in the garbage here in Minnesota. A quick note on powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is a very common fungal leaf blight disease in Minnesota as well as other places in the U.S. It is a fungi. Many of our cultural control practices that work for other fungal leaf blight diseases are not as effective against powdery mildew. And that's because, first of all, it can blow long distances on the wind. You can do great sanitation one year, and it can blow right in the next year. Also, it's one of our few fungi that does not need moisture on the leaves in order to start an infection. It only needs humidity. And so all of our strategies to keep the leaves dry, as long as we get a humid day in Minnesota, that it's going to be enough for that pathogen to come in. So the good news is powdery mildew is a minor stress to the plant, and you can see all these plants are fairly green, they've got blossoms. So it's not a significant threat in most cases to the health of the plant. There's a few severe cases that can take down their productivity. But if it's something that you can't tolerate as a gardener, your best bets for powdery mildews really are a resistant variety because, again, many of the cultural control practices we use for other diseases are less effective against the powdery mildews. Other pathogens we see include viruses and phytoplasmas. These guys are fairly unique because they live actually within the plant cells. So they're not being splashed around or blown by the wind like our fungi and bacteria. They get infected, the plants become infected by either sucking insects like aphids, by nematodes, or it can happen in propagation. You can purchase a plant that's been infected. But then once that pathogen is inside the plant, the entire plant becomes infected. So we may see aster yellows. The symptoms may show up most strongly on our flowers, for purple coneflower here, but you can actually find the pathogen in the stems, in the leaves, and even in the roots. So the whole plant becomes infected, and it will never recover. We can prune off these kind of strange-looking flowers, but the pathogen's still there, and the new flowers that come up will likely have symptoms as well. Another more significant pathogen or type of pathogen we see in the garden are root rot, stem rot, and bulb rot. So these are mostly fungi, but we occasionally see bacteria. And if you think about what the roots and the stem do, they're bringing the nutrients in the water to support the rest of the plant. So if the infection is in the roots or the stem, that's when we see complete wilt and collapse and eventual death of the entire plant. So they're very severe infections. And we tend to see them from time to time. They're not as common as our leaf blight diseases. They can be brought in on infected plants, but often these pathogens can survive in the soil for many years. So they may be there, and until you put the right plant in there, they might not show up. But the best bet with these guys is once you see the disease, to remove the entire plant, roots and all, as soon as possible. And these guys would be a good candidate to take to that municipal compost facility as opposed to putting it in your backyard compost. So with the viruses and the phytoplasmas, we can tolerate them for a short period of time, but they're never going to recover. And so realistically, we're looking at removing and replacing those plants. Root rots, bulb rots, and stem rots, again, we're looking at removing those as soon as possible, getting them out of the garden. Or if we have a leaf blight infection where it just happens to be a very susceptible variety or a very susceptible species, get rid of that plant and replace it with something that's going to do better at that site and be more resistant. And that can be a resistant variety or even a plant from a different family. Now, I do want to talk briefly about pesticides. Because pesticides are commonly available in every garden center, but realistically, they're often not necessary in a flower garden. And they need to be applied regularly, starting from the beginning of the growing season and regularly throughout the growing season to be effective. So a lot of gardeners don't want to commit that much time to using a pesticide to effectively protect their plants. When we do see them being used, it's to protect a really high-value plant that can't be replaced. It's something you want that particular plant. You don't want anything else. Typically, it's something that it has a history of severe infection, and the cultural control practices we've mentioned have not been enough to keep it at a tolerable level. And whenever we use pesticides, of course, you have to read and follow all label instructions. So, quick question, which plant pathogens cannot be managed with a pesticide? So we have our fungi, our bacteria, viruses, phytoplasmas, all of the above or none of the above. Okay. And I see we are running a little short on time, so Christy, I am going to ask you to close this poll early just so we can keep moving. And so I see, sort of mixed votes on that. Maybe I didn't give you quite enough time. So our correct answer is actually viruses and phytoplasmas. And so both of those, because they live within the plant cells themselves, there is no pesticide that will manage them. So if you have those, pesticides aren't even an option. We do have many fungicides that are available, but it's important to understand fungicides are not medicine. So they will not cure a leaf spot disease. This black spot on rose and this powdery mildew on peony is too late. The way you need to think about fungicides is thinking about fungicides as armor. So armor needs to be put on a healthy plant in order to protect it from becoming infected in the first place. So fungicide sprays need to start early in the season. And if you have a plant that has a history of disease, you want to keep it, you've decided to do pesticides, typically what we're doing is 1 year you get really bad infection and we make a diagnosis and say, okay, this is powdery mildew on peony. And then the following growing season, you start scouting. And when you find that first powdery mildew leaf spot, you pinch off that leaf and you spray to protect the rest of the foliage. Then you have to read the label and see what the interval is and continue sprays throughout the growing season to keep that foliage protected throughout the growing season, because it will wear off after time. And as long as the conditions are favorable, we can get new infections. But it's protective and preventative. It's not going to cure these already heavily infected plants. Okay? And I put together a little spreadsheet. This is just me looking on the internet and finding different prices for things, just to give you an idea. If you are going to do a pesticide spray for powdery mildew, you had to buy your fungicide, a sprayer, and the gloves. That's kind of basic protective equipment. You've already spent, $36. And then if you add in your time and just pay yourself minimum wage, to every time you go out and spray at 7 to 10 day intervals throughout the growing season, what this comes out to is a cost of anywhere from $70 to $136 to make those fungicide sprays, depending on how much time you spray and what spray interval you're using. And if you look at the cost of a new perennial in a gallon pot, anywhere from $10 to maybe $16, $20. And so looking at that, you realize pretty quickly replacing a heavily infected plant with a resistant variety or a plant from a different family is actually a pretty cost-effective management strategy compared to using fungicides all season long. And the time commitment's a lot less as well. Okay. Now I do want to make one last comment about bees and other pollinators. So fungicides are pesticides that are, of course, targeted towards fungi and not insects. But we are learning that fungicides may be having a stronger effect against pollinators than what was once understood. There's some new research showing that when bees are exposed to fungicides, they can have increased susceptibility to some of their parasites. We also know that when fungicides are in the environment and they come in contact with other pesticides that are out there, that combination can become more toxic to bees than just the fungicide alone. And so it does look like that fungicides can have a negative effect against bees. And the University of Minnesota Bee Lab does recommend that if you are planting a pollinator garden, so a garden where you're planting flowers that are very attractive to bees and other pollinators for the sake of bringing in pollinators, that should be a pesticide-free garden. And you shouldn't be using any kind of pesticides, including fungicides, in order to protect those pollinators. So to maintain our healthy plants and get the best bloom, we want to make sure we're using cultural control practices in all cases to keep our diseases at a tolerable level. If we do see these severely infected plants, whether it's a virus or a root rot, or it's just a leaf blight that's kind of out of control and growing too strong and taking out that plant, really looking at the practicality of just replacing that plant with something that's going to thrive in those conditions, be naturally resistant because it's from a different family or is actually a resistant variety. So putting in plants that'll do better, and then tolerating low levels of disease. So understanding that it's okay to have a little bit of powdery mildew, a little bit of daylily leaf streak, that what we're looking for are these beautiful blooms, and we can use cultural control practices to really keep these guys in check and get the flowers that we want for our landscape. And with that, I will apologize. I realize I'm about 10 minutes over time. So if you do have to leave us, thank you for joining us. But those that would like to stay and ask some questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer some questions.
Yep, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A box, and then we can answer those. I don't see anything.
Okay, no.
Yeah, we may be done. So.
Okay. And Master Gardeners that are here today, please let me know if anyone is interested in doing a version of this talk for gardens or garden clubs in their community. Just send me an email. You guys should have my contact information. This is a presentation that I'm more than happy to share with Master Gardener volunteers, so please just let me know.
Yeah, and we do have one question that did come in. So what should we recommend if someone can't go to a municipal composting facility for removing that plant material?
Okay, so if they can't make it to a municipal compost facility or there just isn't one available, there's a couple different options. So the backyard compost, even if it doesn't heat up, you're putting it in an environment in the compost pile where you've got those natural organisms, composting organisms, that are breaking down the plant material. And so that's really going to speed up the process of breaking it down. And maybe what they would do is they're taking that compost out of their flower garden, they would then, and they knew it was diseased and not getting heated up, maybe that compost then goes to under their shrubs or under a tree. So they don't put it back into their flower garden. So that's one option. Thyme also will help those pathogens get broken down. It's also important to help them with the diagnosis first. So if it is a virus or if it is a phytoplasma, those organisms will die after the plant material dies. And so in that case, the compost pile is fine, or just burying it somewhere is fine. Tobacco mosaic virus is the only one virus that we know survives in compost. The rest of them, as soon as the plant cell dies, the virus dies too. If it's a common leaf spot disease, then again, just a compost pile or burying that plant material. So say it's, daylily leaf streak, and they don't have a backyard compost pile, they can't get it to the compost facility. If they can put it, in the ground somewhere underneath a dogwood shrub or something, that's a pathogen that's going to go back to the daylilies. It's not going to infect other things in their yard. So at least putting it in a waste pile somewhere away from where those flowers are blooming, because we're looking at it either splashing or blowing back onto those plants. So you just don't want it immediately underneath where the new plant tissue is coming up that next spring.
Great. I don't see anything else. So if we don't have any other questions, I guess we're probably done. So thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing some really great information with us.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.